Welcome back to Conduct Detrimental. This is Dan Worley, your co-host. Unfortunately, Dan Wallach, the other co-host, can't make it today for personal reasons, but we're joined by just a fantastic guest, author, journalist, social media extraordinaire, Jessica Luther. Jessica, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Great. Jessica, as I mentioned, is an author. She came out with a book this fall called Unsportsmanlike Conduct, which you guys can pick up on Amazon. I've read it. I would highly recommend it. I wrote a review on my website, The White Bronco. Really good book on this issue. And as you'll see, Jessica is, really the expert on, sports and violence off the field issues over the last few years. She's also a freelance writer. She's written for Sports Illustrated, BuzzFeed, Texas Monthly, Vice Sports. The list goes on. You'll see Jessica frequently on ESPN's Outside the Lines. And one of my favorite things about Jessica, she doesn't take herself too seriously. So after you see her on Outside the Lines, she'll frequently tweet pictures that are unbecoming of herself, of screenshots of ESPN Outside the Lines on Twitter. Those are always great. And you can follow her on Twitter at SCATX, which has a funny story. Jessica, what's behind that Twitter handle?
Yeah, it was originally I had gone to London. I was getting my PhD in history, and I had spent a lot of time in London doing research and walked through Hyde Park, and they have Speaker's Corner there where people go every Sunday, I think it is, and sort of yell about whatever, or not yell, they sort of talk about whatever they want to talk about. So my original website, my blog, was Speaker's Corner in the ATX because I live in Austin, Texas, and then I shortened it way back when to SCATX.
It sounds like that place is like the basis of where social media came from. That's like basically what it is. People yelling about things that they care about, I guess. So interesting story. So I brought Jessica on today. I want to talk to her mostly about the Baylor stuff. She and her colleague Dan Solomon, back in August of 2015, really broke this story, writing for the Texas Monthly, a story called Silence at Baylor. So Jessica, let's start there. How did you first learn about that case? And how has this whole scandal changed your life since then?
That's a good question. Dan and I kind of joke about before and after Baylor. How that happened. So I've been writing on the intersection of college football and sexual violence for a while. The book that you mentioned is about that, and I had actually already drafted the whole thing before any of this happened. So I think a lot of people think the book came from Baylor, and in fact, Baylor is like 5 pages of the epilogue, something like that, of the book. So I got a tip on August 5th, 2015 from a source that I trust a lot. They told me that there was a player in Waco at Baylor who was about to go to trial for sexual assault, and it was literally nowhere in the media, and wanted to know if I cared about that story. And so as soon as I got off the phone with that source, this would have been late morning, I tried to find the name of the player and connection at all with sexual violence or sexual assault or courts or anything. And I couldn't find anything. And so I called my friend Dan Solomon, who is way better at Google than I am. however that works, he's got skills. And it was because it's like, my job is to be skeptical and to bring skepticism to anything someone tells me, to question it. But the thing that got me was that the idea that he was going to court. That's a really weird thing to say. That someone's going to trial is a weird thing to make up if it's not happening. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so that's how Dan actually found it. He found the trial docket online that had the name of the player, and it was 2 weeks out from when he was going to go to trial. And so I told Dan early that afternoon, I was like, I called the district clerk up in Waco. You can't get documents unless you show up in person, or you have a runner get them and mail them to you. And so I told Dan, I was like, I'm going to drive up there. It's an hour and a half from where we are. He said, pick me up. I swung by a coffee shop, and we were in Waco by, 3:30 that day. And we spent about an hour and a half in the clerk's office looking through the file. And that's how it started.
Wow. And that's really interesting because that's, some of the stuff that I read about that isn't common knowledge. The wonderful thing about the court system is all that's available online if you are crafty enough to know how to navigate it, which I can commiserate with you, especially in state court systems. A lot of those are very antiquated and difficult to make work for you, but you have to kind of keep plugging away. When you wrote the story, I mean, what expectations did you have? Did you know that it was going to blow up, or was it just something
No.
that
No.
you thought might blow over?
Yeah, I actually, it's so weird to think about it now, and it seems almost like a joke on some level. I remember talking to my book editor. He called me because I was behind on edits, and he called me, and I was in Waco by myself because Dan was ill. And I remember answering the phone. He's like, I need your book edits. And I was like, well, I'm working on this story. I don't know if anyone will care about it. I hope that you'll help me push it when it comes out. I think it's important. But like we were so unprepared that we published on a Thursday. It was August 20th. We published early in the day. That same night he was convicted. The player was actually convicted. And by Saturday morning, I was contacted by SportsCenter to go on over the phone and sort of give a rundown of what we knew. And we were so unprepared that like I couldn't get in touch with Dan beforehand to ask him how we should divide up the media. So, you know, it worked out that he didn't want to go on television. So it worked out between the two of us. So like we had not even discussed that aspect of it. So we were caught off guard for sure. And the piece became like the most read piece at Texas Monthly behind like two barbecue pieces that had existed for a really, really long time.
Can't beat barbecue in Texas. Just impossible.
Right. But I mean, it was widely read, and of course it became a whole thing. Art Briles and Chris Peterson went back and forth. That sort of spurred everything. And then, I can't overstate how much we did not understand what was about that.
Well, I mean, fast forward to today, obviously the Baylor story's taken a lot of twists and turns since then, and last Friday there was the 6th Title IX lawsuit filed against the school. And the thing that struck me about this lawsuit, aside from a lot of the allegations in it, which we'll get to in a minute, but was the lawyer who filed it, and his name is John Clune. That may ring a bell for some people that follow this industry, but he's pretty well known for representing victims in Title IX cases. He's represented the victims in the Jameis Winston and Kobe Bryant cases, among others. I know that you followed the Winston case pretty closely. What impressions do you have of John Clune?
Yeah, I mean, he is one of the leading legal experts on this issue, right? Going back to Colorado in the early 2000s. He's out of Boulder, and he sort of, between Kobe Bryant and the University of Colorado's stuff, he sort of fell into this like role around this issue in sports. And, he's a lawyer. So as a reporter, I have to always sort of remember that he's got clients and, he's working towards that. He, seems to take on these big cases. Victims seem to trust him with them. I think he's a good source for a reporter. I take everything with a grain of salt though that comes through a lawsuit and from a lawyer.
Yeah. And as you should, as a lawyer, I can tell you that, obviously everyone's advocating for their client. It's their job, and it's fair. And I think that's, whether you're the reporter or whether people reading your pieces or other people's articles, I think that's a good piece of advice. Just kind of take it with a grain of salt and understand where he's coming from. He's not lying, but at the same time, he's, doing his job. But one passage stuck out to me. He released a short statement about this lawsuit when it was filed on Friday. And the passage was, as hard as the events of Baylor have been for people to hear, what went on there was so much worse than has been reported, which was pretty striking to me. What did you make of that passage?
It's always hard. I mean, as an investigative journalist, one of the things I've learned over the last few years is you always know a whole lot more than you're ever able to publish about. You hear all kinds of stories. I imagine Clune's probably in a similar position to us, where lots of people tell us lots of things about stuff there. I assume he has investigators working with him that help him figure his stuff out. So, I mean, I'm not surprised to hear him say that. I mean, it does feel like that a lot of the time. He might have more concrete stuff than we do. I mean, the numbers in this new lawsuit are, they were shocking even for me. So, I mean, I'm not surprised to hear him say that. I do think there's just so much stuff. This has been an incredible unfolding of information.
Yeah. And that was, I mean, when I read the lawsuit, I think the first thing that struck most people and the way that it was reported were those numbers. So that was totally out of the realm of what you had sort of internally calculated. Is that what you're saying?
I mean, the numbers that Baylor gave us, or that not us, they gave the Wall Street Journal, back in October, it was 19 players were reported by 17 women.
Yep.
Is that correct?
I think so. I think that's coming from the Pepper Hamilton report, if I'm not mistaken. Or is that different?
I'm not sure. It was definitely a quote that the Regents gave to the Wall Street Journal.
Got it.
And I don't know. So those numbers are high, and Clune is good at this, right? Credit to him. You know, he says 52 instances of rape, I think is how it's written in the lawsuit. 5 gang rapes. That's that, man. Like, I feel like we just got to sit with that. So this could be, 5 instances could be, we know the first player who was convicted at Baylor, there have been 2 so far. A third guy is going on trial this year. I think 5 or 6 women came forward. So that would be 6 of those 52, right? And so the numbers are difficult to sort of suss out in the way that they're written.
Right.
Because it doesn't, those could be repeats, like not repeats, but the same person perpetrating the crime over and over again.
Right.
Man, they're high though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even when you sort of think through what they could represent,
That's
and
crazy.
not.
And I think they also quote 31 players in there, and I think part of the discrepancy, which was I think maybe in a footnote or noted somewhere in the lawsuit, was that they took it over a little longer time span than
right. It doesn't match
report. Right.
It doesn't match Pepper Hamilton, which is also confusing when we're looking at these two things. There's just so much, right? Like, I just feel like it's kind of remarkable how much there is around stuff.
It is. And I think another remarkable allegation, at least to me, the one that really stuck out to me when I dug in, one of the players accused of raping the plaintiff in this lawsuit was alleged to have previously raped a Baylor student athletic trainer. And then apparently, or allegedly, I should say, the school gave her a scholarship in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement to keep her quiet about it, and then didn't punish the player the first time. I mean, this is insane to me. This is something that, from obviously everything is very terrible here, but from the school's acting position, this is seemingly as bad as it gets. Have you ever seen anything like this before, as far as a school acting that way?
Sure, Baylor did it. I mean, this is one of the things that first case that I was mentioning where the guy was convicted in 2014. One of the things that's come out around that is multiple of those women who said that player had assaulted them said they told Baylor, right? And nothing happened. And that's a different player than what we're talking about in this new lawsuit. So the school itself has a pattern, at least with 2, if we want to call that a pattern, of hearing about something and just sort of sitting on it and then it happening again. But yeah, that's not an uncommon thing. You often, I mean, as far as the school not acting on it.
What about the school, like actually giving a victim a scholarship in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement? I mean, that seems like it's going even a step further.
Yeah, I'm trying to think now. I lose track of all the cases. Whether or not I know that in particular. Certainly schools intervene and do things to try to get victims to be quiet or be okay with very little punishment, if at all. But whether or not I know that there's a financial transaction in that sort of way, I can't pinpoint.
Right. Okay. And then another one of the allegations in the complaint that was striking was having to do with this Baylor Bruin program, which is a host program run by females at the school and involved with the school, which helps show recruits around as hosts. And there's some allegations in there that the expectation of the school is what they'd be more than hosts. But specifically here, one of the perpetrators allegedly called a girl in this group immediately after the rape to apparently ask her to come help with the situation. And she immediately showed up on the scene, tried to persuade the victim to change her story, and also tried to mess with a police investigation that was currently going on because the police had shown up right then. I mean, can you talk to me about these programs that go on at different schools and how they can be a factor in sort of, encouraging this sort of behavior?
Sure. So they go back really far. I think Bear Bryant at Alabama in the 60s was the first one to use all-female hostess groups when trying to... The word I use all the time is lure. Try to lure players to their team. It was a really big deal. Like I write about this in the book. There was some huge feature in Sports Illustrated in the late 80s, sort of, it's kind of a gross feature about like these pretty ladies and, the stuff that they do to make the recruits feel comfortable, welcomed on campus. The implication, there's always sort of the insinuation that sex is involved.
Right.
Every single athletic department anywhere, any coach worth any salt will say that that's not true, that doesn't happen. But there's like endless across time accusations around this, right? And this is one thing that bothers me about recruitment in general. We don't pay players. And so something has to stand in, right? For why does a player choose a school if it's not to make money, which is how most of us choose where we put our labor. And so they do lots of things. They pay their coaches $9 million to be the very best coach who's going to coach the hell out of you and make you the best player ever. They put millions and millions of dollars into top-notch facilities. I literally just saw a thing today about how Clemson added a slide to their... Yep. Yeah, I was like,
mini golf and just...
Mini golf, and like they'll pay people who just stand around and make you smoothies when you want. Like it's an amazing, the facilities are fantastic.
Right.
For some athletes, it's the education, right? That's a whole debatable issue around like what kind of education they're getting, but certainly that for some that plays a role. But then the other thing that programs do is they use women. And often there's an implied access to those women and sex with those women in how they recruit them. And so sometimes it's really benign. Sometimes it's stuff like they will Photoshop a picture of the player walking hand in hand on the cover of Rolling Stone with Beyonce, which is the idea of like, if you come here and you're a big deal here, you will get the beautiful woman and you will get the fame that comes with all those things, right? Yeah. Which is pretty benign in and of its face. But then like it's on a spectrum of sort of the access to women and what does that mean? And so, once it's like all female hostess groups, which are actually, you're not allowed to do that anymore, but that's its own thing. It's like some of these women, we learned this from Lane Kiffin at Tennessee. He got in trouble for his hostess group there. The women in that case there's a book called The System, and they talked to the authors of that book about like how they would use social media to have like, a year-long friendship with these players, right? You hear from players all the time. Like you can find endless quotes of them saying, well, I knew that if I went to whatever school, there'd be pretty girls there. Like that sex would be part of the package. Like they'll say it if they're asked outright.
Right.
And then we have moments where we learn that this is actually happening, right? And there's two things. One, possibly that these hostesses are having sex with these players. And I don't ever want to judge those women for those choices. I'm much more interested in like what coaches look away from rather than what these guys and these girls are doing. But there's plenty of cases where recruits are involved in sexual violence on their recruiting visits. And so all these things start to get blurred together, right? So it's not like because you have a hostess program, therefore sexual violence will happen. But we have to be thinking in big terms as far as like, what are these coaches telling these 17-year-old guys about what women are for and why they're on campus and why they're around them? And then connecting that to like why are recruits committing sexual violence when they're visiting the schools, often, with other football players around. Gang rape's a real issue in these cases. And so all of that sort of melds together. It's difficult because it doesn't, just because you have a hostess program doesn't mean the sexual violence will happen, but it's about the culture that's created when this is what women stand for, what female students are about for these football players. And so in 2004, the NCAA tried to end this. Sort of, can I curse? Can I say half-assed?
Yes, we have an explicit rating on our podcast, so go for it.
The sort of half-assed way that because there were huge scandals both at Colorado and Miami, where women were raped, came forward and said they had been raped by recruits on recruitment visits. And part of that got tied in with these hostess programs. And so in 2004, the NCAA, it's a weird rule, so stick with me here. So the rule is for student host groups that work with athletes, the demographics, the gender demographics of those groups, they must match the general hosts for the general population of students who come. So if you're a university and you only have female students show around all the students who come to campus through your admissions program, then in theory you could have all women working with athletes, right? But most schools don't do that. It's like 50-50, right? Because that makes sense because you're recruiting all kinds of people to your school. And so that's the actual rule. Like, it's the university against itself, like how it recruits the general population versus how it recruits athletes. And it works like it does. And Oklahoma State just got in trouble for this a couple of years ago, for this exact rule. And then, of course, I feel like when we talk about this, we have to mention that the Louisville scandal, which, of course, is not hostess groups, but it was explicitly coaches, the basketball scandal, the coaches providing sex for recruits and players, just sort of shows that this is part of what's happening. I mean, it's very explicit when you're hiring sex workers in a way that you don't get as explicitly with hostess programs. But this is all sort of embedded in this new lawsuit. This is this long history of these things happening and the connection between recruitment and sexual violence, which Clune alludes to in the lawsuit because he was involved as a lawyer in the Colorado case, the big lawsuit back then.
So you touched on one issue that's near and dear to our hearts, that's paying players. And stick with me here, but I get your point that there's a lot of issues that go into it, and one of them, when they have these host groups that are females, are exploiting females and showing them that, oh, this is what you'll get if you come here. Let's say, for example, that you could pay players. Do you think that would actually help the sexual abuse from that perspective of, that wouldn't be as much of an issue? When I pick a job, I probably will choose it for money and not for these other things that will now be less important because money is a factor. Does that make sense to you? Do you think that's possible? I
think it's possible. I mean, we also live in a society that objectifies and demeans women, right? Yeah. So like that part of it is there. And so it's not necessarily going to end that. And if schools do, this is the thing about this system, right? Like if they feel like it's useful and works for them, they're going to keep doing it. And this is certainly true with, like you see, like after Louisville, I think it was Jason Whitlock, which, God forgive me for this, but I think it was him that was like, I don't think this really happens or it doesn't really affect anything. These guys aren't choosing to go to these schools because of these women. It's like, well, okay, I guess, but we do know it's happening, right? And I'm a reporter, and my job is to say what's happening. Mm-hmm. So we do know that schools are deeply invested in this, and they do it. If Louisville, if nothing else, showed us this. And so I certainly don't think like paying players would end this if teams and coaches and athletic directors think that this is something that will help them.
Right.
Get recruits, but certainly it's hard to imagine that if they were able to bid on it, like, the way that you go to one employer and say, well, this guy's going to pay me whatever, and they up the bid on it, Like that kind of thing is, I feel, probably going to be more effective as a tool for getting the best recruits. I don't know. It just seems like that edge that you get from having the prettiest girls, who will be the nicest to them, to the players, that edge is gone,
right,
in a way that I would hope would be better than how it works now.
Yeah. And that was my point. I think obviously it wouldn't solve the problem, but it's conceivable that it would help it. And that's something that hadn't really even crossed my mind before. I'm an advocate of paying players, and we've had some guests on the podcast to talk about that before. So it's a interesting, different angle. We've touched on, the Pepper Hamilton report a little bit, which is interesting for me. Obviously, you know that they haven't released all of the findings, and that's been a contentious point in a number of lawsuits, in the press as well. I mean, what do you make of Baylor's, the administration's, and the Board of Regents' actions to that point? Do you think it's nefarious, or are they just doing this as a sound legal defense?
That's a good question. I mean, I do think it's probably more than anything a legal defense. Like, that makes the most sense to me.
Yep.
Yeah, of course, it's endlessly frustrating, right? Because part of what they've said at one point was that it would just take too long to create it.
Well, that's BS.
Yeah, right? That's BS. And also, like, if you had just done it then, it would already be done. Like, we wouldn't be asking for it anymore because it'd be over. And so, yeah, a lot of it is, I would guess that just makes the most legal sense for them. I mean, I don't really have a sense of it. This is just me speculating.
Right. It was just disappointing that they came out and said, after a lot of the reporting came out, that they wanted to be transparent, and then now that they're clearly not being transparent, and so it really kind of shines their true colors, in my opinion. But I get it from, they got sued again yesterday by an ex-football operations person. They're facing probably double-digit lawsuits now.
Yes.
And releasing the details of all this and not hiding behind the attorney-client privilege, which I think is what they're trying to do, could be very damning. So,
well, I was thinking that when I was reading the latest lawsuit from Friday. I haven't read the one from yesterday yet. I just read the Waco Tribune's article about it. I think you tweeted it. But even reading this one, Clune wrote this lawsuit, and he cites Pepper Hamilton repeatedly, right? Like, this is evidence so we know that this was an issue.
Right.
And so certainly I would imagine, like, the very specifics of it. I will say that, one of the things that they have said repeatedly is the issue of privacy for victims, right? And on some level, that too feels like BS because you can redact. At the same time, that is the one part that holds me up here. Even if they redact, I worry about these women, that we only know of women so far as victims. That doesn't mean certainly that it's only been women.
Right.
But that these women who, I don't know what it would be like for you if you've moved on, where you're trying very hard to move on with your life. And then even just to see the redacted version of your story, out there in the news being discussed and talked about,
Right. And not only that, but we know that, as you said, some people are very good at the internet, and these women, a lot of these women have been outed on various occasions on back channel message boards or whatever.
That's the one area where I will sort of give them space. I think they could probably do it with care in a way that does as careful as possible for these victims, but also sort of meets the greater good of just knowing more in public about this. People continue to send their children to Baylor without a real sense of what exactly happened. Yeah. Even though we do know a lot, I will say.
Right.
But that is, I will give space for that, and sort of thinking about what this would be like for victims who would possibly be very nervous about their stories, even the redacted ones, being out in public.
That some of the victims may think the opposite? Not only
absolutely
that they want to get the story out there. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Yeah. And that's always true. You always get at this sort of range. And I will, credit to survivors. Dan and I reported in August, Pepper Hamilton was hired, within a few weeks of that. There was some sparse reporting in that fall of 2015. And then at the beginning of 2016, survivors started to publish their stories on blogs and come forward in that way. And then sort of in the wake of that, you know, they were doing public vigils on campus. And then the ESPN reporting, I think, began in February of 2016. Paula Levine's reporting for Outside the Lines. But there was this moment where, like, it came back to the fore because survivors brought it there.
Right.
And so when Levine dropped her stuff, it was sort of in the context of this discussion that survivors had. And so it made it even more powerful. It's very good reporting. But, you know, certainly you're always going to find survivors who do want to tell their stories, and they do want them out there, and they do want to hold the institutions accountable. It's just very hard to be a public survivor, and that's something that people really have to make the choice for themselves to do, because we are so incredibly unkind to people who come forward to say that they've reported being the victims of sexual violence.
Yeah. I'm going to ask you a fill-in-the-blank question, because I used to like getting fill-in-the-blank questions in school. Based on what you've seen, the Baylor administrators and coaches were A, active participants in facilitating sexual assault, B, turned a blind eye, or C, in the wrong place at the wrong time?
I think it's more B than anything. Mm-hmm. I think it was sort of willful ignorance around an issue. I cannot go back to this enough, and this is something that Dan and I talk a lot about, Dan Solomon and I. In January of 2014, well before any of this stuff became a big deal, a Baylor football player was convicted of sexual assault. And in his trial, 5 to 6 women came, I can't remember the exact number, it might be 5. 5 women came forward. He was convicted of raping one of them. But the DA, the ADA in Waco, got 4 other women to come forward and say that they had been victims, right? So at that point in time, if nothing else, they had to have known that there was at least one incredibly egregious case where nothing was done, and there were repeated acts of violence around a football player, right? And so it's not that, like, this wasn't a known issue. And then, you know, the player that we reported on, he had already been reported by that point in time. So this guy's convicted in January 2014. They already have a report of another player, and they know this at this point because he's already been investigated. And so, like, to me, it much more feels like they just sort of turned away from it rather than trying to meet it head on. And then I will add also that we know from Paula Levine's reporting that Ahmad Dixon, who was a player on the team, that he had been reported for sexual violence, and at least he told Levine that at least one coach knew about that. It's hard for me to imagine that only one coach knew, but we know from reporting that at least one coach knew. So, like, it's hard for me to imagine that you could know that and then sort of just say, well, you know, not do anything in the face of that. So it's much more sort of turning away, which is very common. I actually think that's the biggest issue in college football, is just sort of the turning away, even when you recognize the pattern. Right.
And we should just see how this most recent lawsuit plays out, because I think it probably had the most egregious allegations that I've seen amongst the Title IX lawsuits. And one where, and I'm blanking on Art Briles' son's name.
Kendall.
Kendall, yeah. He has an alleged quote in there saying to a recruit, "Do you like white women? We have plenty of white women here." And that sort of seems to almost cross the line of turning a blind eye to sort of being part of the problem, you know, if it is true, of facilitating this culture so much. I mean, that seems like a pretty direct hint at, you know, these allegations from the player. So I don't know. I think this lawsuit will be the one to follow most closely going forward. What do you think about? I was tweeting about this suit on Friday, and a lot of people were enraged about it. And the most common thing I got in my Twitter replies were, "This is the death penalty. This NCAA must stop this." I mean, what's your opinion on what should be done to Baylor's football program?
I don't know. I don't know if my opinion on that necessarily matters. What I will say about it, and what I try to remind people of all the time, are there are just no NCAA rules about this. Like, you know, the one that I've heard that's most convincing, and Sally Jenkins just wrote a piece about this for the Washington Post, is the idea that the players got preferential treatment from in the investigations, right? And you cannot treat athletes any differently than you would treat the general student population. I don't know if that holds water because they didn't do a good job generally around this issue.
Right.
So I don't know if you could really, but like that's the closest rule break that you get around, which is, I just think people think that there's some kind of rule that got broke here. And we learned with Penn State that that's not true. Like the NCAA tried very hard to punish Penn State for very similar cultural failing within the program. And they had to walk it all back because there was no actual rule violation. And so, I don't know. I advocate for the NCAA to do something like to create a rule around any of this stuff. Not that I think the NCAA would be good at enforcing it. But at least on a symbolic level, it would show that you care about this issue enough to write a rule. Like you don't even care enough to write a rule for it. And then on top of it, when something this major happens, then there's actually a rule you can lean on if you do want to do a punishment. I don't know enough about the death penalty. People I know that do say that just not really possible here, that the NCAA is just not going to ever do that. I don't know. It's really hard to say at this point, like what should be happening to this program. They have replaced a lot of people. They have a new coach, lots of new players. And that's why I wrote a book about the system. It's not just about a school. It's not about a place. It's like the entire system needs reform really around this issue, or we're going to just keep having it. Like there's no part of me that thinks like now Baylor is fixed and this won't happen there again. The system encourages us to turn away and to not pay attention and to not care about these issues of violence against women. And so I just imagine that will keep happening. And I don't think at this point the NCAA can do anything about it because they literally have not written a single rule.
Yeah. And I think they would have to shoehorn it into something else. I mean, I think there's maybe some recruiting violations that could be alleged, but it would be tough. But
yeah,
and I don't know if you know this because you probably don't follow the legality stuff so closely, but one of the key factors for the death penalty is that you're a repeat offender of major infractions, and Baylor has done that. I think they've been found guilty of major infractions over the last 10 years a number of times. So I think that
the football program has.
Yes.
Okay.
That at least sets them up to having a chance for this to happen. But again, I don't know, and I think the NCAA took their lumps with the Penn State decision because they just jumped into that without any backing of a rule, without any of their own investigation, and ultimately had to eat it and the penalty. So,
yeah.
Have you seen anything on your end about how this has affected the school as far as the general student body? Has applications been down?
I don't know. I don't know if we've seen that. That's a really good question as far as like applications. Certainly the recruiting in football hasn't been hurt from what I've heard. Right. I will say, like, one of the things Pepper Hamilton did is they gave Baylor over 100 recommendations, which is extensive, right? And Baylor, we talked earlier about their transparency, but one thing that they are doing is they've created a website where you can go and look at every single recommendation and they update it based on where they are with implementing it. And, I think we should always take everything with a grain of salt, especially with institutions and what they tell us they're doing. But I have heard that they've poured a bunch of money into the counseling center and that has made a difference in students' lives who are trying to access counseling. They put a bunch of money into Title IX to buff it up and to make it better. One of the issues around this problem in particular is harm is being done now. Like, we know that. We know about the ubiquity of this kind of violence. But fixing it, it's like turning the rudder on a cruise ship. Like, it takes a while. It takes a while to get it right. And that's hard to handle that because we know that harm is being done and we don't want harm to be done. We want it fixed now. But it does take a long time and we often don't hear about it when it's good, right? We only hear about it when it's bad. So I'm not sure like how we'll measure what's going on at Baylor unless people are speaking out about it, and they probably won't unless it's bad. But yeah, that's a good question about the applications, and I'm not really sure about next year. And there's sort of like the two extremes here. I often hear parents tell me like, I'm never sending my child to Baylor, which I'm like, okay, you should not let your child out the door. Like, does your kid go to high school? Because sexual violence happens there too.
Right.
But then the other side of it is like, this could be one of the best places to go right now, if that's your concern, because they are so focused on it and doing better about it, around it. So who knows sort of where they fall at this moment.
Interesting. You kind of touched on this a little bit, but like and I know you wrote extensively about it in your book, but like what are the things that universities like could and should be doing to help protect women and to help set the right culture?
Oh, what could they be doing? Well, I mean, I'm a huge proponent of prevention. Punishment only goes so far, and like we do need to have an answer for like when it happens. What are we going to do? But we are in a punishment obsessed sort of society. Like, what's the punitive part of this? And it doesn't seem to be doing much. Like, that's all we've been doing on this issue, and it's just like things are still bad. So I do think there needs to be a lot more around prevention. And Title IX does, as the DOE has been interpreting it, Title IX does demand prevention, but it needs to be really consistent. Like, what I hear is that, you get it once for 20 minutes when you walk in the door to a university, and that's sort of it. But there need to be like really honest discussions about consent, and beyond that, sort of like what a healthy relationship is. Like, kids get to college and they don't even understand that. And I do wish that like we were teaching these things to 5-year-olds in kindergarten. Like, I'd be down with that. But that's not happening either. That's its own issue. So for me, like, asking like, what is the school doing to try to make sure this doesn't happen, to teach students better communication in their relationships? Do they understand what consent is? I go to campuses, I ask kids if they know what Title IX is. They have no idea. They don't know what to report to Title IX. They don't have a sense of like, if you're harassed by your professor, like, you have a place you can go and talk to someone about how to manage that and make sure that stops. They don't have any sense of that. So there's still a lot of work to do just in the education side of it. There's intense focus on compliance, especially around the punitive side. And I just not sure where that's going to get us as far as ending or mitigating this kind of harm.
Yeah. And it's funny you say that, because there's such a clear parallel to the NFL's handling of domestic violence. It's the same thing. They're just so focused on penalties, and they don't follow through with their own prevention and treatment plans that really are what's going to stop the problem, not just deal with the consequences.
And on some level, I will say I think that's a PR issue too for the NFL or for these universities. Like, people get really upset if the punitive doesn't match their sense of justice or what they want, right? Which is often at odds with what victims want, I will say. People are often much harsher than even the victims in a lot of these cases as far as what they want for the punitive side of it. And so I do think a lot of like the NFL, these universities, they end up responding to the PR nightmare of the punitive part of this. And they just don't get people. Like, people ask me, like, what can I do? It's my school. Like, even if my school's not in the news yet, people care so deeply as alumni. I'm like, call them up and ask them about prevention. Like, what's the education going on? Who's in charge at the school? Are they getting the funding that they need? Blah, blah, blah. Like, you can do that kind of work, but people just don't focus on that. So that's not to, like, don't ever mistake me for, like, giving leeway to these institutions. But I do think we sort of focus so hard on the punitive that they end up focusing so hard on the punitive, and then we all fight about the punitive, and we're so rarely talking about anything else.
Yeah. Well, I'm way over, but I want to ask you one question before we go.
Sure.
So you were quoted in our mutual friend Julie DeCaro's article this week at some point about the incoming Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, and when she was at her confirmation hearing, she refused to answer questions about Title IX guidance from the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights, which were changed recently. The standard of proof for a school to be able to determine whether a sexual assault took place changed from preponderance of the evidence to clear and convincing standard. Actually, the opposite of that. But just with her, and then with Donald Trump too. I mean, what is the potential here? What could possibly happen? What should we be worried about with the new administration?
Yeah, so it's, the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Education is who you complain to when you think that your civil rights have been violated on campus. So Title IX functions as like if you don't feel like you're getting equal access because of your gender, because of this gender-based crime or violence that's happened to you, right? And so the DOE has released a bunch of stuff over the last 5 or 6 years about how to interpret Title IX that universities have been trying to meet. And that's been, good. It's made them take seriously this issue. And that could all just go away. Like, it's really unclear what the DOE and the OCR under DeVos will look like. And if they'll care about this, if they'll rescind those kinds of things. I do think at the same time, I still think universities respond a lot to PR. And I think, no school has been financially punished under Title IX, like for having a Title IX violation. All the money they put out is in lawsuits. And so that part of it, the bad PR and the lawsuits can continue just fine, even under DeVos. So I'm not sure how much of an impact this will really have. And universities have put a lot of money and a lot of resources into implementing these programs. And, the less cynical part of me wants to believe that they don't want their students to be in spaces where they've been harmed, like that they do want to do something about it. But, it does matter if Title IX, if the OCR at DOE stops taking complaints or does nothing with them. That's not good as far as making progress on this issue.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jessica, for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Anything else you're working on right now that you want to talk about?
Nope. Just same old, same old.
Same old, same old. Awesome. Well, everyone, please give Jessica a follow on Twitter at SCATX. And thanks again, and we'll talk to everyone later.